Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss comments from our current Brexit Minister David Frost, as reported in the Mail on Sunday, and the former one, Michael Gove, and what it means for the apparent change in direction from the British government over the Northern Ireland Protocol. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, as we head towards the last week of November, which is the month where everyone was fairly convinced that the UK government would finally push the Article 16 button and begin moves to suspend parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol unilaterally. What we're now seeing is an almost certain climb down from Boris Johnson and David Frost. Now, I don't know what David Frost thought about this. I'm not sure whether he still wanted to go ahead with the suspension and if he just feels that Johnson pulled the rug out from under his feet. But regardless of what Frost himself thinks, publicly he's had to recommit to a negotiated agreement. He's still moaning at the EU, of course. You know, a piece in the Mail on Sunday quotes Frost as saying that the EU need to have more urgency about them. Now, I could point to the fact that the EU have come up with a lot of comprehensive proposals worked out by talking to businesses in Northern Ireland and asking them what they wanted. I could also point out that the UK government haven't done any of this. They've not gone talking to Northern Irish businesses and come up with proposals based on what they want. I could also point out that it is the UK government that are complaining about the arrangements in Northern Ireland that they negotiated and signed into law. This isn't a case of the EU going, look, this isn't working, we need to come to an agreement. The UK government going, yeah, we agree it's not working, and then them having to come to an accord. This is the EU going, we're quite happy with this. This is the UK government going, well, we're not. So where's the impetus on changing it? I think it's fair to say any objective person would conclude if there's any urgency to be had, surely it's on the side of the UK, who are the one who wants changes. The EU are happy enough with how things are. Northern Irish businesses are getting on with it. Some of them doing rather well out of their unique best of both worlds position that Boris Johnson sold them. And this Mail on Sunday piece even highlighted to anyone paying attention that any urgency should be on the part of the UK government, not on the EU. In amongst it all, there was a little line in the article that said, businesses in Northern Ireland are starting to give up on British suppliers and buy from Ireland or elsewhere in the EU. This was what David Frost was saying. Well, tell me exactly how that is supposed to impress upon me the notion that it is the EU that need to act with urgency. I'd suggest that right there is a reason why it is the British government that should be acting with a bit of urgency. And that urgent action can no longer be unilateral suspension of significant sections of the protocol. Bear in mind, there have been unilateral suspensions of parts of the agreement. That's already happened. There are things that the British government promised to do and isn't doing. We are already in material breach of the treaty. But the EU are being pragmatic and are acting and reacting proportionately according to the impact of the breach on them. What David Frost was threatening to do would have required a major reaction. And I don't know what it is that made the government pull back from the threats. You know, was it the EU threatening to tear up the Trade and Cooperation Agreement? Was it the statements from the US Senate and House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committees? I don't know. All I do know is that 2 weeks ago, the UK government were ramping up talk of triggering Article 16. Lots of people in the EU, in Whitehall, in the Labour Party, amongst Conservative MPs, in the media, everyone thought that it was now inevitable that this month Article 16 was going to be triggered. Then the tone changed completely. Now all the talk is of a negotiated agreement from the government. So can we now assume that they've now given up on their plan to simply wish away the Northern Ireland Protocol and think that they can just unilaterally abolish it and the EU will just go, well, we're not very happy, but all right then. We probably can for now. You know, I wasn't too sure at first because you never know with Boris Johnson. But now that Michael Gove has piped up, you know, he said at the end of last week that the government was confident that talks with the EU would be resolved without what was termed a bust-up with Brussels. In other words, triggering Article 16. almost like Frost's intended tactics were used rather more successfully against him. Because bear in mind, it was Michael Gove who was our informal Brexit minister throughout last year. During the actual transition period, he negotiated with Maros Šefčovič, still have to get used to the right pronunciation, that they agreed the practical application of the protocol. And it was all agreed at the end of last year. He was replaced by David Frost early 2021 due to the fact that Gove had agreed terms with his counterpart and a number of Tory Brexiteers weren't impressed with their purchase. Bear in mind that the ERG only supported the withdrawal agreement because Boris Johnson promised to renege on it, so they say. So what they really didn't want was for Michael Gove to successfully negotiate a practical implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, as he did late last year. David Frost, on the other hand, claimed to be able to win major concessions by bullying tactics. Leave it to me, lads, he said. I'll tell you what, we'll threaten the fragile peace process in Northern Ireland and the EU will cave in. He boasted about how these tactics worked an absolute treat right up until this month. But he appears to have made a couple of miscalculations. First, he underestimated the threats to the single market posed by his proposals. Because one thing he was right about is the EU don't go overboard. So, doing something that you really shouldn't do, that's a bit of a breach of the treaty, they don't go absolutely insane on the reaction. But he obviously didn't think that the EU would consider it that big a deal if he suspended much larger portions of the protocol, and he obviously certainly felt that it wouldn't be worth their while trashing the entire agreement. We got that wrong. Second, he underestimated the unity within the EU. Now, I don't want to overplay it either, but Frost said that he thought France and Ireland would be isolated in the EU. However, when other major EU member states started talking about tearing up the trade and cooperation agreement in response, which they are permitted to do before anyone cries foul, it's right there in the treaty, you can do that, then the UK government was forced to pause. With all government sources now downplaying the prospect of an Article 16 showdown, certainly this year, including Frost, and with Michael Gove making a rare public statement, because he's not heard of much these days. We see more of him in Scottish nightclubs than we do in interviews. You would imagine that what we might call the doves have wrested some sort of control over Johnson. Because although a committed Brexiteer, Michael Gove doesn't actually want a trade war with our most important market. Rishi Sunak, come to that, is also mindful of the economic consequences. In fact, outside of Boris Johnson and David Frost, I'm not actually sure which cabinet ministers, if any, would really welcome a full-on trade war with the EU. I could imagine a few, but I don't think I've heard any say so publicly. Obviously, the whole thing, could end up being thrown into chaos again next year. It really depends on what Boris Johnson really wants. And if Boris Johnson even knows what he really wants. If he wants to make a big deal of the fact that the EU court is the final arbiter on the application of EU law, including in Northern Ireland, then he's probably not going to get what he wants. But if he would be happy with a fudge that can let him claim that he got what he wanted, well, that probably can be arranged. In these sort of things, fudges can also always be arranged. If he wants almost all physical checks on goods passing from Britain to Northern Ireland to stop, again, he's not going to get what he wants. Like a Tory MP was whining this week that the EU's proposals to cut down the number of checks only apply to retail goods. Right, that's still applying to more goods than Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement allowed for. Because we must never forget during this mess that there should be little need for negotiations at all, and absolutely no need for negotiations on major changes of the protocol. The negotiations for the withdrawal agreement were concluded late 2019. Boris Johnson said he was delighted with them. He sold the deal to the electorate and won a majority in order to implement it. Early 2020, he implemented it. About 10, may have been last November actually, but let's say 11 months later, 10 or 11 months later, Michael Gove agreed to a practical application of the protocol. So the negotiations were really sort of done. But a year after leaving the EU and signing the withdrawal agreement into law, he suddenly had problems with it. What a tough titty. Šefčovič recently said that Britain needs to stop coming to the table with problems. From his point of view, he keeps coming up with proposals and then the UK government keeps going, yes, well, fine, yeah, okay. But now we have these other problems as well. You know, the bottom line is there are some in the Conservative Party that are not going to be happy until the protocol is gone completely. Boris Johnson needs to decide if he can live with it or not. I mean, he's going to have to live with it. It's not like his choice, really. So what I suppose I mean is, will Boris Johnson accept that he can live with it quite soon, while he can claim victory by taking the EU concessions? Or will he insist on the trade war before finally accepting it in a much weaker position? Because that's what I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. You know, for now, the threats from the EU, maybe the US, have been enough for the calmer voices in his ear to persuade him to give the negotiations a chance. If they don't get him what he wants, then the other voices may get louder in the new year. You know, and this may well end up being a proper merry-go-round for some time to come, where we start off for several months, a little cycle. We've seen the same cycle with COVID, haven't we? We'll have a cycle where it's like, oh, we're going to trigger Article 16, that's it, we've had enough of this. They get to that point, and then someone goes, yeah, but that's going to really screw us up. Oh, okay, we'll negotiate a bit more. And then they go, the negotiations aren't working. Right, we're going to trigger Article 16. What do you mean you're going to start a trade war with us? Oh, we don't want a trade war. Right, okay, we'll negotiate a bit more. And so on and so on. But we can probably breathe a little easier until the new year at least. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.